Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This program emanates, World Watchers, from KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 684, January the 14th, 1985. The last few weeks I've been talking about the British American Canadian Corporation that was formed in May of 1945 within hours or days after World War II was over. It had the express purpose of setting up a spy network that would continue after the shooting officially had stopped. The network would cover every major city in the United States, 47 different countries. The express purpose was to rebuild Germany and the munition cartels and make sure that they didn't coexist with the Soviet Union, and also history proved that their goal was to separate every possible country from the Soviet Union that they could, and to remove the Labor Party or the people striving to get out of the rut of the Third World and assure them dictatorships and literal poverty unless they went along with our way, and our way was these dictatorships. And part of the World Commerce Corporation was that Permindex operation described in the Torbett document on the assassination of John Kennedy. One branch of the World Commerce Corporation was to set up the assassins that would kill heads of states or witnesses or people that interfered with the selected candidates that these particular people and multinational corporations wanted. Now, in the past week, I've spent many hours, that telephone time that I cut down, outlining the connection of the World Commerce Corporation to two particular and definite corporations out of hundreds that were set up, maybe 150 or more. Those two being the Pepsi-Cola Company and Donald Kendall, and the other Warner Lambert, run by Elmer Bobst. Bobst came from Hoffman LaRoche, the IG Farben pharmaceutical, and then set up his own. And these people manipulated Richard Nixon into the presidency and Ronald Reagan into the presidency. I've always said they were the selected agents of a few people. Actually, they seem like a lot of people, but they're small in terms of our general population. And in the next few weeks, I'm going to spend maybe 2 or 3 hours in chronological order detailing the use of two corporations to select candidates that would become presidents of the United States by way of assassination, and the links of world commerce to specifically the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and making way for Ronald Reagan, even if they do it in Nelson Rockefeller, Adlai Stevenson, Hubert Humphrey, everybody that would oppose these two, Senator Frank Church, they all went down the wayside one way or the other. And we were left with Ronald Reagan now, and as he said when he won the election, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now, I just want to mention 2 items about the OSS, because it was William Donovan of the OSS and Alan Dulles, working with British intelligence, William Stevenson, that set this up. Just a book that many of you may have, but if you don't, you can get at the library, Piercing the Reich by Joseph Persico, has a photograph of William Casey when he was working in the OSS under Bill Donovan. And there's a description of him that he was the chief of secret intelligence for Europe. That's our current CIA director at the present time, who is decimating Central America for interests like the sugar lobby, the liquor, the cola interests. Central America is the sugar cane, and Dominican Republic and Haiti and Puerto Rico and Nicaragua, Guatemala have always been in the hands of these people for cheap labor and exploitation. So William Casey is applying now to what he learned in the years when the war was over and during the war down in Central America. But during the war, just at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the Malmedy Massacre, when William Donovan was in and out of that, weaving his way into that, Casey was given a special organization described in the book Piercing the Reich. The initials are DIP. It was called the Division of Intelligence Procurement. And that was to specifically carry out what they referred to as the German venture, absorbing the labor division and going into Germany behind the scenes So when General Patton came marching through at one end, William Casey had been working with the Germans inside of Germany. Now, part of this explains why it was so successful that the Nazis were immediately taken up to special places like Oberammergau and worked with our intelligence community, and were not prosecuted, were protected, because there was somebody inside of there, and William Casey was one of those people with secret intelligence in Europe. Otto von Bolschwing, who came over this country, was in the SS, the Gestapo, and he worked with the OSS, which was Mr. Donovan and Mr. Casey and Alan Dulles. Klaus Barbie was in the Gestapo, the SS, and then he was protected by the OSS and worked with them. SS Karl Wolff, who safely got down to South America, was SS liaison between Himmler and Hitler, and the OSS with Alan Dulles working out of Bern, Switzerland. So simultaneously with William Donovan's weaving back and forth at various positions with British intelligence and Alan Dulles at Bern taking care of the Italian end, up in Germany was William Casey, and these people have been very close through the years. The continuity of 40 years is present all the time, and I can now draw lines of then and now and show how they work together at various times and places. Incidentally, the book Where's the Rest of Me, written by Ronald Reagan and Richard Hubler, Hubler, came out in 1965, and there's an interesting thing about Ronald Reagan with the OSS. This is the only time yet, maybe I'll find it in the future, of course, that of his working with the OSS, because I've charged and made statements about working with Errol Flynn when Flynn was in the Gestapo at Warner Brothers, 1940 and 1942. But the book, Where's the Rest of Me, says that Ronald Reagan, during World War II, was a captain in an Army film studio, which we know out in Hollywood, when he was not doing propaganda films, telling you to go off and fight the war while they're already making deals for businesses when the war is over. Reagan, I interposed that. Reagan's group was closely collaborating with the OSS and with the spies from the OSS. The OSS obtained plans for the V-1, V-2 rocket launchers from Peenemünde, and the U.S. Army built the exact replica in Florida. The Army then bombed the replica, and Reagan's group filmed the bombing of it. Now that's very important, because the story was that these rocket places were being bombed by the Allies, and they had to move then to another space. And the heads of Peenemünde, Mr. Dornberger, moved to Dallas-Fort Worth area to be charge of Bell Aerospace, and Mr. von Braun moved to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to become the head of NASA. And maybe Peenemünde wasn't really bombed. Maybe they kept it intact and told people that it had been bombed, and they filmed the bombing in Florida. I can't imagine what reasons there would be to show that we're bombing Peenemünde, to go to the trouble and build it, when we can just bomb it over there and photograph it while you're doing it. But it's interesting that Ronald Reagan was part of the group that was filming this simulation, because later he works closely with all the members described in the Torbett document, the World Commerce Corporation, involved with the murder of John Kennedy. Ronald Reagan, in California as governor, afterwards, before, we was right next to these people and in and out with them, and Mr. Dornberger's contacts in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So it's interesting that he was part of filming the Peenemünde, that these men would leave and then come to the United States with their expertise. Reagan's film group also used the OSS spies and helped build a model of the Tokyo, I don't know, maybe all parts of Tokyo, for use in films. I know that Errol Flynn coaxed the Navy and Warner Brothers to make a film at Pearl Harbor and in San Diego in 1940. But Flynn was in the Gestapo, and that was turned over to the Japanese and was used for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Really treasonous act. But Reagan's film group was working with the OSS, and except for this particular book, I've never seen that his name was mentioned there. Now, the most important item, as far as I'm concerned, in the coverage of news right now, and there certainly is a lot of news, is the appointment of Edwin Meese. Ronald Reagan renominated as Attorney General Edwin Meese, and the investigation by Jacob Stein was supposed to clear him, although the subjects that he investigated were limited to certain matters, 11 specific allegations of Edwin Meese, and there's more to Meese than those 11 allegations. The head of Common Cause, Archibald Cox, of course, criticizes Meese's conduct, doesn't think he should be the Attorney General, and Cox is pretty influential and respected in Washington, D.C., but there's some pretty tough people on the committee, the Judiciary, to go past, and they're locked in their minds. And I'll give you the names of those members of the Judiciary again. I did it once before, and if you don't have them and you're listening to this on the radio and don't get the sheets that accompany these broadcasts, the tapes, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I will give you the members of the Judiciary to write for an appeal to please turn down Edwin Meese or go into some of the matters. The San Francisco Examiner has an article, had one January the 6th. Meese still faces a tough time in the Senate. So maybe you can make your voice heard. Don't just say, well, I know I can't influence anything. Just get that pen moving, like I said before, and let's see what we can do with it. The Washington Times, which is the Reverend Moon paper, says there's a move that has been launched to deny the cabinet post to Meese, and Common Cause is looking into the discrepancies of the 385-page investigation that Mr. Stein issued. I have the 385 pages. It was given to me by Johann Carlisle, a researcher who also provided other information I'm going to share with you now. I'll read it this week and then go into the points of those hearings with you probably next week. Now, Mary McGrory was writing in the Oregonian, the Washington Post, a syndicated column, "There's no stopping Ed Meese now." And she cites people like Jeremiah Denton and John East of North Carolina and Paul Laxalt. They all like him. Well, when you read that, you may think, well, there's no point in working, but that's only her opinion. The Los Angeles Times, which certainly represents a pro-Reagan, pro-Meese, after all, they came out of California, has an editorial, "Meese the Wrong Man," and they're asking that he not be made Attorney General. If there's anybody that should know about Meese and the law, it would be the California branch, if they would only remember some of the things that went on here when he was legal advisor to Ronald Reagan. So the editorial is saying Meese the wrong man. The San Jose Mercury had a story just 2 weeks ago. Senator Howard Metzenbaum will oppose the renomination of Meese. His aide, Mr. Myers, isn't there now, but he is very insistent in opposing it. Now, there was an article about Raymond Donovan, an important story, and it's written by Morton Condrake. And again, this is from the Washington Times, and it's also, I think it was reprinted in the New Republic, and they shared it, several other magazines picked it up. Morton Condrake is executive editor of the New Republic, and he wrote this, and I was surprised to see it in the other paper. It's called Lapses in the FBI Inquiry, and it's going into the Raymond Donovan case that I'll bring up some more on that if we have time this evening. But he mentions the problems with Mr. Donovan and Mr. Maselli, the wiretaps that went on in 1978 and 1979, this member of organized crime referring to Mr. Donovan, and the fact that Francis Mullen, the high-level FBI, he was from the drug enforcement, worked with high-level FBI people and cleared Raymond Donovan. And Mr. Condrake says that before Mr. Meese is confirmed, he ought to be asked by the Senate Judiciary what he knew about Mr. Donovan and when. And so should Mr. Fielding and Mr. Webster and Mr. Mullen. I believe when we were talking about Donovan a while back, I brought this up. Well, Mr. Mullen of Drug Enforcement Agency has conveniently resigned before the hearing, so he doesn't have to testify. Mr. Fred Fielding should have been out at the time of Watergate for covering up the various Watergate crimes, and Mr. Webster should absolutely be turned down or fired, or a special prosecutor investigate Webster with clearing Mr. Donovan. But Meese is a part of this because he goes back to the early Ronald Reagan career and the links to organized crime and to Jimmy Hoffa and Hoffa's murder in the Schiavone construction company that hired the man who allegedly killed Jimmy Hoffa. The closeness of the Teamsters to Ronald Reagan's career and to Richard Nixon's is very important, and Meese as Attorney General, wouldn't be able to cover any of the links to organized crime, like John Mitchell couldn't, and Ronald Reagan is covered up Paul Laxalt's links to organized crime and Raymond Donovan's. They're beholden to crime. That's how they got into the White House. But this is the Attorney General, and if you want criminals off the street and you're known a debt to organized crime and you want them stopped, certainly speak up and send letters to these various people. As I say, I'll give you their names and tell them some of these points that I bring up, or any that you have in your own mind. Now, back in March, it's almost a year ago, March 26, 1984, I was talking about Edwin Meese and the Biotech Corporation, and Edwin Thomas and Ursula Meese and their links to these biology labs. And there has never been a proper expose. This was not one of the 11 things they investigated. But what did she give the money to Mr. Bryan for? And describe Mr. Bryan, this Dr. EARL BRIAN, because he was the head of health, education, and welfare in California when Reagan was doing the electrode implants, wanting to put them in at UCLA with Dr. West, but doing them at Vacaville and doing them at Atascadero, and the experiments on prisoners or other persons that were put into mental hospitals in this state. Now, Dr. Bryan is very important to these labs, these medical labs, the Associated Biomedic System in Buffalo that I mentioned, working on human biological products. It failed the food and drug requirements. Dr. Bryan means something to Mrs. Meese, Dr. Stuart Bryan. This is what opened up the investigation in the first place. And yet, Mr. Stein and the powers that be never went into those medical labs, the biotech labs, and you're going to hear more about those in the future. They're very controversial, and the work they're doing is controversial. And why would she, when she's short of money and moves to Washington, give the $16,000 over to Mr. Bryan? For what reason? She, Mr. Thomas loans her $16,000 that she turns over to a lab. What interest does she have in the labs? And this is very important. Now, Ed Meese has been involved in many military and local police organizations, and that is where the danger comes in with the press in the White House having their own news reporters, the Grenada invasion without the press, the chance of a Reichstag incident at any time. This is Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan's forte, and under the guise of terrorism, they could create a situation and take control of the country. He works closely with the organizations that are set up just for that, closer, I imagine, than any other attorney general has been in the past, even more than the background, say, of John Mitchell. He's worked with the military, the local police intelligence. He's been working for them for 20 years, waiting for this momentum to build up, and his intelligence, most of it is on dissident groups who don't agree with the administration or with the policies that, say, World Commerce Corporation set up in other countries and in the United States, individuals who got wise to political assassinations in the 60s and 70s, to the illegal Cambodia bombings, to the napalming, to the tiger cages, to the Phoenix program, to the Kent State. When people got out on the streets and said, we've had enough, the killing of black leaders, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and so on, Meese and Reagan sat in Sacramento and worked, to keep track of the people who objected, not to solve the problems. And again, this list of people comes from Johan Carlisle up in San Francisco. I have files on some of these, but he put it together very nicely. During the Reagan governorship, with Ed Meese as the chief of staff, the de facto government, the following criminal justice and intelligence systems were developed, and of course they still have those files. The worst was the Operation Garden Plot and Cable Splicer, which was to take control of the country in case of an emergency. And Reagan said at one of their meetings, if they heard me heard what I was talking about, they'd think I wanted to take control of the country, and that was quite a while ago. The Garden Plot and Cable Splicer is the worst. The LEAA is another group that was stopped after the protests after Watergate, and Mr. Robert Mardian of the Justice Department was part of that. And the LEAA was funding Dr. Jolly West and the CIA and Dr. Bryan for the medical experimentations, and particularly work to do on blacks, Indians, minorities. The LEAA was really a mini Gestapo. The OCJP was the Office of Criminal Justice Policy that Meese set up. Project Search was another one of his policy projects. Project Safer California. I have the complete book of Project Safer here with its horrendous police state tactics. The OCCI, the Organized Crime and Criminal Intelligence Branch. It had nothing to do with organized crime. Modalists and their friends, the Teamsters down in La Costa, close to San Clemente, and I'll do more on that later, were all flourishing. Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohn. Crime was developing its roots. The Oriental Japanese Mafia, Chinese Mafia, and this has nothing to do with organized crime. That's what they called the intelligence division in Los Angeles Police Department when they got in trouble sending their material to J. Paul's Computers for Western Goals and for the John Birch Society. They gave it a name like the Organized Crime. The Organized Crime and Criminal Intelligence Branch is another police state tactic. The CSTI he formed, California Specialized Training Institute for Police and Rounding Up. The Los Angeles Police Department, the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, grew directly out of the criminal conspiracy section described by Louis Tackwood in the Glass House tapes. Incidentally, I have at my home from Avon Press the first manuscript, the sample that was sent to Louis Tackwood. He was staying at my home when he had just completed the book, and they sent it to him to read to make sure that he didn't want any changes, and he didn't take it with him. When he was staying up here, he autographed it and gave it to me, and that's among my collection of books that I think is very important for personal and historical reasons. Another group is the California Crime Technological Research Institute. That was another one of his hanky-pankies on searching and entering and stopping people and rounding up. The LEIU was one of the most dangerous, and I have files on each one of these if you want me to break them down. The Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit. The Search Group Incorporated was another one. The SWAT teams. The SWAT teams got their real inauguration or surfacing at the time of the Patty Hearst kidnapping when they rounded up these 6 people down to Los Angeles at a home nearby that Louis Tackwood used to use, the LAPD used for prostitution, to fix up white people in the police department and visiting dignitaries with black women in that Compton area right near there is where the SLA were taken and then burned alive, I always say on the evening television, and then came the glorious SWAT teams, which are all over the country now, but that was their introduction, saving the American heiress. The search group, let's go back, IOCI, the Interstate Organized Crime Index. I did the SWAT teams. The NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. The CCH, the California Criminal Histories Section. The SSIN, another group of studies of people. The Vacaville Mind Control Program that they were running with the Justice Department, with the LEA, with Dr. Mark, Dr. Irvin, Dr. Sweet, who came out from Boston, and Dr. Bryan, the friend of Ronald Reagan, and Nancy Reagan, and Ursula Meese and Edwin Meese, who was running the California HEW, was reporting to Caspar Weinberger, who was the head of HEW in Washington, D.C., where the LEA money was going to experiment on prisoners, poor blacks, electrodes and electric shock and implants, all kinds of things, and lobotomies, a lot of lobotomies right through the eyeball where they didn't have to do surgery and could erase the memory. Plenty of that going on in California. Western Goals that was set up just recently when Ronald Reagan, 1979, just before Reagan became president, but was in operation taking material from the police department in Los Angeles, and they're operational in other cities around the country, working with the police department and Edwin Meese's material. Their spies, Mr. Jerry Ducote and John Reese, who spied through Alfred Bloomingdale and Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese. That material was into the police departments, ordered destroyed, and then put into computers while this current president of the United States and his White House aide, Edwin Meese, are in Washington. They kept this off the wire services for the most part of an entire year, still keep it off, and it's very much linked to the past the illegal spying and setting up of provocateurs by Reese and Ducote specifically for Meese and Reagan, and to make street scenes and troublemaking that where they could come in and bring the police and the SWAT teams. The Church League of America was another cover for Edwin Meese that he was working with. The United Churches of America, another, the Former Intelligence Officers Association, another group that he was very close with, besides the data banks of the official police department, things like the John Birch Society that was set up and closely monitored and working with Mr. Skousen, a former FBI agent, former chief of police in Salt Lake City, who set up computers that are equal to the FBI themselves. He moved from Utah to back east to Washington. John Birch Society working with those particular people, and Edwin Meese close to and always part of the John Birch Society. He worked with the Minutemen, and he and Ronald Reagan, with Intertel. Intertel moved into Las Vegas when Vance Cooper, as supposed to be Howard Hughes, it was Vance Cooper, was moved from the hotel. Intertel moved into Vegas, where Paul Laxalt was the governor of Las Vegas and now runs the campaign and is close to Ronald Reagan, the GOP, and Edwin Meese. The Vatican Knight Corporation is one of the largest police forces, and secret documents supposedly guarding airports and army bases. They're even out here at Fort Ord, guarding military bases. And the Vatican Knight Corporation was set up at the same time that Ronald Reagan became governor here, and Mr. Kirk in Florida set that up with retired FBI and CIA agents and social and Secret Service agents from the various agencies retired to go into the Vatican Knight Corporation. They were close to Information Digest, John Reese's bulletin that he would send to police departments. He maybe still do it with the names and addresses of particular people and where they live. And part of Citizens for Law and Order, of Research West, of the Hoover Institute, the Rand Corporation. Edwin Meese had his school in San Diego where he was a professor, and worked with people from the Heritage Foundation that had their own inroads into these particular computers. And then his friends at Pepperdine, the Juvenile Delinquent Program, got special benefits, and they are a nucleus for teaching police force and surveillance in times of emergency. There's special courses going there. Edwin Meese has been involved in all of those things, helped set them up, helped set up propaganda through the various studios, and working in and out of the prison systems with those particular wardens and doctors from East and West, CIA, and elsewhere. He has been a part of all of that. He also is part of incidents that were set up. His name is history out in California. I've talked, when they were running for president and for White House aide, I talked about the California violences, and those broadcasts are available. But you might think and write to some members of the Judiciary about the free speech movement and the role that Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan had to put it down, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the putting down of the Black Panthers, the People's Park, and the murder there that Reagan and Meese delighted in, the Vietnam Day celebrations that were broken up, where they hired the Hells Angels to plow into people, putting down the ACLU, the Lawyers Guild, the feminists, and, encouraging prison riots and snitches and provocateurs in the prisons. Way before other states, the COINTEL program really took off. California was mushrooming, and this was the testing ground. And a lot of things that happened in other states were just carbon copies of what was happening out in California first. I'll take a 1-minute break now and go back to a little bit more of Meese and then on to some other matters. This is Mae Brussell. This is part 2 of World Watchers International. It's broadcast number 684. January the 14th, 1985. Now, I rattled off a lot of letters for you of organizations Meese formed and Ronald Reagan formed, their love of the military, their pushing mind control experiments at the hospitals and in the prisons, the terror of California. I did broadcasts on that when Ronald Reagan was running for president. But not only is he president, but you have this attorney general with his mind for gathering names of protesters, people that worked with the Black Panthers, that helped them, that helped Cesar Chavez and tried to bring in wages for the farm workers, the Venceremos organizations, the Chicano groups. If you didn't like napalm to Vietnam, your name went on a list. If you approve of abortions, your name went on a list. Everything that you did to try to change society that was your legal right went into their heads, and not only did they gather and have gathered these massive computers, which they sent all over the world and to the BND in Nazi Germany. I call it Nazi Germany. That was set up by Reinhard Gehlen. But they set up the provocateurs for the killings, too, and the killing of People's Park, and hiring the Hells Angels to plow into people objecting to shipping napalm and objecting to Vietnam, the Phoenix program, and protesting the war and the actual Nazi behavior in Vietnam, that our country became so cruel and bestial, trained by members of the Gestapo working with the American Army. And Meese wanted that. He worked well with it. Reagan worked with it. But now Meese becomes the Attorney General, and then you never, ever have a chance, any more than with the crime figures I mentioned, to overturn this or get him out. Because if you can pass him and all this now, they'll say you didn't speak up earlier. There's a conference in Washington this summer, June 24th, 26th, under the auspices of what is called the Second Jonathan Institute Conference on International Terrorism. And this group had a long list of people who attended it. One of them, one of the presiding speakers and officers, was Lord Chalfont, Chalfont of Great Britain. He is the partner with John Layman, Secretary of the Navy, the Abington Corporation, a very dangerous man, and he was not touched by any investigations that should have been done when John Layman was approved as Secretary of the Navy. Layman is ready and talked about World War III, how he's going to attack the Soviet Union. I've ordered the transcript of that. These people want the war, and when you talk about terrorism, that is their cover for preparing for the World War III. Another speaker was Jack Kemp, Representative Jack Kemp from Buffalo, New York, one of the most conservative in the country. And other people at this conference that were talking were people from Georgetown University's Michael Ledeen, the person who's close to Licio Gelli and the Masonic Lodge, that wants military dictatorships tried 4 or 5 times in Italy and is close to the White House. Arnaud de Borchgrave, who is a liar about disinformation, works with Mr. Moss and writes stories blaming the Soviets for what the United States is doing. Claire Sterling was part of the conference. Britain's Bernard Lewis, U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and attending the conference along with George Shultz, the Secretary of State, was White House counselor Ed Meese. Also attending was Jeane Kirkpatrick, who gave her famous speech at the United Nations on the Soviet Union, what they knew and didn't know when the Korean airline went down. This is a team of pathological liars that would put the Reichstag to shame. What they could set off and what they have in the offing would give these people the total control of the United States, with no recourse. They have the guns and the weapons to do what they want. Another person that attended the meetings was Louis Giuffrida. I can't pronounce it right. Giuffrida. Giuffrida. He's the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. That's another one set up by Edwin Meese. I should pronounce his name because I should be doing hours of broadcasting on FEMA before he takes over. And there's even talk that if there's a vacancy in the Supreme Court, that Giuffrida would become a justice of the Supreme Court. The total police mentality. And also attending the conference was William Webster. And de Borchgrave, as I say, works with Robert Moss, changes the stories of history. And, of course, they keep pushing the Aja KGB connections and not the role of Licio Gelli in the context with Aja, with the CIA, the Nazis, the very dangerous assassins, and very much farther right than people imagine, that already have been trying in Venezuela and Brazil, making arrangements to kill the Pope for other reasons. But in this case, they were trying to instigate and start a World War III if the Pope had died from the bullets of Aja, and the links of his traveling through Bulgaria becomes a subject for Jeane Kirkpatrick. Now, when Alexander Haig became Secretary of State, I read that the very first book on his desk before he was administered oath of office was Claire Sterling's book about terrorism on the left. Haig is closely tied with NATO. He was the head of NATO with Licio Gelli and the top people in Italy that want the military dictatorships, but they carry those books around like they're Bibles. But the important thing about Ed Meese is this is the company he keeps. He's close to these people, and the fellow Robert Keith Gray, who bailed out his wife and got her a job when they had financial problems, quickly pulled in $40,000 a year for her. Robert Keith Gray represents the Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies. He charges them nothing, and Gray has close links to the Vatican. He was the one who pushed the ambassador to the Vatican that the United States hadn't had for many, many years. They work closely with the Knights of Malta, with this information, with the anti-Soviet line, and that's what Meese was doing in California. He was honed up great for that, and now as the Attorney General, it would be a nightmare. Now, you can write to the Judiciary. I'll give you the address here, to U.S. senators. These are senators, and I'll give you their names. You can choose the ones you want. I'll give you a few on the air quickly, and then, as I say, you can send for this list if you don't have it already. The Senate Office Building is 112 Hart Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C., 20510. 112, the Hart Senate Office Building, 20510. Now, the members of the Judiciary hearing the Edwin Meese story again, one is Strom Thurmond. Now, Strom Thurmond was linked to Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. Mrs. Thurmond worked for Robert Keith Gray. I think that he's too close to voting on Edwin Meese being the Attorney General when the area that would be touched in legal questions would touch. Mr. Gray has 150 clients. Talk about the World Commerce Corporation. He represents the who's who, and we've mentioned some of them on the air. Robert Keith Gray worked for Task Force 157 for George Bush. Strom Thurmond is part of that group, the Wilson, Turple, Nugan-Hand combine. So certainly if you want to write to him, say, you can't vote for Edwin Meese because you're too close, and your wife are too close to Robert Keith Gray, Edwin Meese's closest friend, who bailed out Mrs. Meese's money, so therefore Meese will be indebted to him. So Meese can't make a decision against 150 corporations that Robert Keith Gray represents or Henry Kissinger represents, because he was his boss over Task Force 157, and also their boss there was Bobby Inman, who now has these giant computers down in Austin, Texas, that can combine any information from all over the country and all over the world. So Strom Thurmond isn't the person you write to asking a favor. You write to him and tell him what you think about him. Charles Mathias, Jr. of Maryland, you might send some kind of a letter challenging his intelligence or his integrity on the conflicts of the provocateurs in California, the murders of people at Altamont, at Isla Vista, the SLA burnings, the role of Meese here that have never been exposed. How can he become our Attorney General? You can write a letter and let them know you're intelligent. You don't have to be shy about what you know. And many of you have my past broadcasts, the sheets that accompany those. Just look at what I said about Meese. Look it up and paraphrase your own letters. Now, Paul Laxalt is part of the Senate Judiciary. Well, Laxalt is one of the closest friends of Robert Keith Gray. Laxalt has strong ties to the mafia, the organized crime. He suppressed the 60-minute program on his links to the mafia. What do you expect of the senator from Nevada who was the governor? He was there when Howard Hughes wasn't there and knew he wasn't there, never saw him. So the decisions our Attorney General would make on any mafia stories, you know, Paul Laxalt still brags about his friendship with Mo Dalitz, and their links to Robert Mayo and the assassination are almost legend, the organized crime links. So if there were appeals to open up the Kennedy assassination again, which is open for all time, what would Paul Laxalt vote when he is so close to Robert Keith Gray, who befriends Mrs. Meese, and Gray can tell, just whisper anything into Meese's ears as the Attorney General and gets what he wants. Orrin Hatch, another one of Utah, with strong, very conservative links to the John Birch Society, to all the fundamentalist organizations, and close to and working with Daniel Graham of the High Frontier on various organizations and front organizations. Orrin Hatch supposedly on an anti-drug committee with Daniel Graham, the partner of Fritz Kramer. He's supposed to vote on Edwin Meese when many of his contacts in the past are linked to crimes that have been covered up so far that should have been opened up. Now, Orrin Hatch was on the committee to pass Donovan, and he knew something was wrong, Raymond Donovan, and he voted for him to be Secretary of Labor. So even though he specified that if Donovan had these connections he couldn't vote, he voted for him, so he isn't his own boss, so he's supposed to vote on Meese. Robert Dole is on the Senate Judiciary, and he has political ambitions and seems to be looking a little more moderate than Ronald Reagan, so you might bring up a few points to him. John East of North Carolina, it would be very hard to appeal to him. You might say, if we open up the Kennedy assassination and go into the Green Berets and the Special Forces and Mr. Frankenberry's statements about how they were behind the training of the assassins who killed John Kennedy and shot in the window of Edwin Walker, how would you vote if Meese were the Attorney General? And we're talking about Fort Bragg in North Carolina. What would you think of that? And Jeremiah Denton of Alabama, a Knight of Malta, along with Mr. Casey and Alexander Haig and a lot of other people in Washington. He is a great terrorist. He sees terrorism everywhere if it's the left, if it's Castro, Fidel Castro or Gaddafi or domestic terrorism. Jeremiah Denton is not fair. He has his blinders completely over his eyes. He has the particular Ladine, Claire Sterling line down pat. It would be hard to ask him to be fair about voting about Mr. Meese. Now, another one on this committee is Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania of the Warren Commission. Are you crying? These are the people that are supposed to vote on Edwin Meese. These are the ones that I know are in Congress. I didn't check out a couple of these that whether they lost the election or up for re-election, but I'll give you their names anyway. Arlen Specter was the liar about the bullet that 399 that was supposed to go through John Kennedy's back and up the air through his John Connolly's, went through Kennedy's back and out his chest and into John Connolly, and then into Connolly's arm and into his thigh, and it was found on the stretcher. Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania worked with the CIA because you had to be on the Warren Commission. I don't know how close he is to Edwin Meese, but Edwin Meese helped, and Ronald Reagan helped suppress information of witnesses when Specter was working on the commission, but he wouldn't have asked for them anyway. They're all one of a kind. But he has certain political ambitions. I might suggest writing a letter to Arlen Specter. I may do that. Now, Joseph Biden of Delaware is fairly decent, and you might bring up things like the lab that Mrs. Meese put her money into, and let's find out who this character is, this Dr. Bryan, and why she had the necessity to borrow the $16,000 to give to him just the day after the inauguration when they hadn't paid for rental on their house in Washington yet. Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts is on this committee. I don't know how much work he'll do on Edwin Meese. I'm sure he's not interested in the covering up of too many crimes, whether it's the mafia or the Nazis or the Kennedy assassination. He's always looked the other way. It's very convenient, and I'm sick and tired of it, going to Africa and parading there and wanting to free prisoners there, which is very important, but why doesn't he go around this state and find out who killed his brothers and put a little interest into trying to save this country from those assassins? Howard Metzenbaum is the one fellow who's been very vocal about this particular matter, that he does not want Mr. Meese. Patrick Leahy of Vermont is somewhat of an unknown. You might write to him. Dennis DeCuccini of Arizona. Howell Heflin of Alabama. Of course, Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson is so filled with mafia, a home base of mafia and drugs, that I don't know that maybe he knows Meese would go along with those people, because that's Meese's reputation, as it was Ronald Reagan, is Reagan's, and it was Nixon's. They are working with the crime syndicate, and they're not going to prosecute, they're not going to nosy around. And how strong would these particular people be? If there even was the kind of a Reichstag thing, would they look back and say, we made a mistake? It's like the approval of Raymond Donovan for the Secretary of Labor. But now very many people are saying we made a mistake. Well, that's a little bit about Edwin Meese. I'm sure you have your own ideas and can come up with them. The main thing is that whatever you think or feel, do something, because it's now or never. This man, as Attorney General, will be a total disaster. And just as you see your freedoms taken away with Reagan wanting his own White House press service, he doesn't think the press is nice. You know how nice the press was to him these 4 years? All these things they could have brought up. And his 75 people that are under indictment or investigation now, they treated him with kid gloves, just, they're so kind to Reagan. I can't believe it. And now he has to have his own press service because he doesn't think they were kind enough. Well, I think his own press service is to get ready for the police state where you issue the orders and don't have to have interviews or see anybody. What you say is final, and you will see him less and less. And that's why he's setting up his own press service inside the White House. Now, several weeks ago, I was talking about the Nazis up in Idaho, and I want to update a few things with you on that are very important, and then do more at a later time. Broadcast 679, it went at length, that was in December the 10th rather, about these various Nazis from the Grand Dragon from Texas, the Klan, up north in Idaho with the Aryan nations, and Robert Miles, one of the people that was up there, the Grand Dragon of Michigan, and Don Black, who was appreciated that Ronald Reagan called them freedom fighters, the men that tried to invade Dominica. But I also mentioned somebody from Buffalo, New York, Alexei Erlanger, Alexierlanger, of the liberation movement of the German Reich, from Buffalo, New York, that goes up north to that compound to have their reunions or gatherings every year of the Klan and the Nazis and the Posse Comitatus and so forth. The identity group all go up and have this big reunion. And Alexei Erlanger, the information I got about his name was in the Oregonian, November the 18th, 1984. They mentioned that he came there from Buffalo, and I referred to labs and questions of germ warfare coming out of Buffalo. Well, David Miller in Florida got a transcript of this broadcast, and he immediately called me and reminded me in the book Aftermath by Ladislas Farago, which is the story of the reunion and the rearming of Germans after the war. Where did the Nazis go and what happened to them? On page 384, it refers to several people of interest. One was President Wilfred Kernbach of Chicago, who announced that Alexei Erlanger of the Buffalo chapter of New York City was heading a drive to bring two famous German war heroes to the United States for a visit of our military institutions and our German community. One of the guests invited was Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, who did come to the United States and went through Rockwell and various military installations, and his other close friend was Colonel Otto Skorzeny. The old Skorzeny, called the most dangerous man in Europe, the man who took the Hitler funds, the Bormann funds out of the Swiss banks into Madrid, into Ireland, and disseminated them to Nazis to build up their corporations and form the Odessa. The very people meeting up in Idaho with the Klan and the Dragons and the Posse Comitatus are directly linked to Nazis such as Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, U-R-L-I-C-H, Ulrich Rudel, and Colonel Otto Skorzeny. So if you think that this is a group of individual kooks, have another thought about it. They are very dangerous. I just want to refer to two articles about them that may illustrate the point. One comes from the Oregonian, mailed to me by a listener who's been sending me all of these articles out of Oregon, December the 30th, 1984. And they're describing the man who wrote the book that was the prototype for the Nazi takeover of the United States called the Turner Diaries. you've heard about that book, but I don't know if you know about the man. His name is William Luther Pierce, and he quit the university. He taught at the University in Oregon, at Oregon State University, until 1965, and then left there and went east. This article from the Oregonian says Pierce quit his job as an assistant professor of physics at the Oregon State University in 1965. He later became editor of the National Socialist World, a magazine published by the American Nazi Party, written to appeal to the academic world, his college people, the intellectuals, and the professionals in this country. The Turner's Diary that he wrote tells about the American media controlled by the Jews. It publishes a hate list for extermination, the blacks, the Jews, the Asians, the Chicanos, the intellectuals, government employees, mixed marriages. Now, this William Luther Pierce was born in Atlanta, Georgia, of course. He got his master's and doctor's degree at the University of Colorado, important nest for a lot of these Nazis in that area. Record shows he worked as an assistant professor of physics at Corvallis University for 3 years, and it gives his salary $8,000 for a 9-month year. And at the same time, he was doing basic research directed with a $35,000 grant from the United States Air Force Science to do research in semiconductors, teaching at Oregon State University. While at Oregon State University, he joined the John Birch Society. He supported Barry Goldwater in 1964, the candidacy for president, and worked for the GOP when he lived in Oregon. In 1966, he gave an interview, and he said his interest in the American Nazi Party started when he was at the Oregon State University, and he was disturbed by people, the intermarriages, the interracial marriages. It profoundly disturbed him, and that's when he joined the John Birch Society. Pierce refused to tell the officials where he was going when he quit his job, but when he went away, he said he was taking a research job at Pratt & Whitney Company in New North Haven, Connecticut. Pratt & Whitney is United Technology. That's where Alexander Haig, later knighted as a Knight of Malta, and the head of NATO, was president of United Technology. And Mr. Pierce goes there. Then he leaves United Technology, Pratt & Whitney, that branch, and he joins the American Nazi Party that was originally founded by George Lincoln Rockwell. I mentioned that before. Pierce quit his job. He was making $29,000 a year at Pratt & Whitney and took post as editor for the National Socialist World. Rockwell, the party's commander and Pierce's mentor, that's the fellow that Lee Harvey Oswald had his name in his address book, Rockwell of the Nazi Party. Rockwell was murdered by another follower in 1967, and then the Nazi movement splintered. Interesting enough that Rockwell was the mentor of Mr. Pierce, who wrote the script for the takeover and overthrow of the United States. And when Rockwell is killed, in comes a man who was a professor at the University in Oregon, who worked for the United States Air Force with a science grant of $35,000, and then goes to United Technology, Pratt & Whitney, and takes a $29,000 job. And then as soon as Rockwell, with his connections to Oswald, is killed in 1967, he takes over the party, the National Socialist White People's Party, a Nazi group, and he becomes the prime information officer for the party, and it was headed at one time by white supremacist Matt Kohl, Koehl, one of the stronger Nazi groups to emerge after Rockwell's death. Kohl was that member of the Posse Comitatus that was shot down and killed with the barn and weapons, all the weapons that he had stockpiled when the federal agents came in. It was Pierce who was responsible for putting the group's telephone answering machine on a recorded message in 1970 calling for the murder of Senator Mark Hatfield, George McGovern, and William Fulbright. They are traitors. They don't support the war in Vietnam. And he said there's only one way to deal with a traitor. You kill him. He also has answering services where he gives the name and addresses of Jews in your community so you can find them. In his novel that he wrote, Mr. Pierce, the Turner Group has a secret membership, and they would take over the nuclear missile complex at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, which is very possible with his connections to the Air Force and a network of very secretive professors and intellectuals ready to do the job. Ultimately, they would trigger a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States on the presumption the major cities contain most of the blacks and most of the Jews, and most U.S. cities are destroyed in the Armageddon. 90% are in the liberated zone, and then the organization, that he calls it, would use nuclear weapons all simultaneously to destroy Israel. And Turner's group then begins what they call the Day of the Rope, in which execution squads move through the country, killing non-whites and mongrels. The streets of Los Angeles, for example, are lined with hanged bodies of professors and white persons who have married blacks. A number of the murders were committed by general citizens rather than the execution squads. They get into that. He says, I'm sure that without the forceful lesson of the Day of the Rope, we would not have so quickly elicited this kind of citizen cooperation. They all come in and help them. And then from now on, when all the Jews have been killed, and he uses Los Angeles as an example, from now on, it's uphill, reorganizing, re-education, rebuilding this whole society, and ultimately the neo-Nazi group will have created a radically and racially pure society. And that is the script that is used not only by a few up north, but throughout the country, throughout the world, with links to people like Otto Skorzeny and Buffalo, New York, the top Nazis of the Reich, who are continuing this. And John Birch Society, of course, used Mr. Revillo Oliver, who wanted to gas all the Jews in America, and said that at a 4th of July celebration. Now, just quickly, I want to refer to a New York Times article, December 27th. It's a long, almost a half a page of the New York Times by Wayne King. Links of the anti-Semitic ban bring six-state parley. 6 different states began to get together because their allegations are that they will destroy the federal government and the FBI, and they've had shootouts with the FBI. So up to this point, the Klan have not been a threat to the United States. The Nazis have not been a threat. The FBI never cared about them. But finally, the agents from Washington, Alabama, California, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, met in Seattle to discuss their strategies. As I say, that Gordon Cole was killed in May of 1983, but he was shooting at FBI agents, and several FBI agents have been shot. Now, their operation involves counterfeit, bank robberies. There was just a bank robbery up in Canada, $53 million, a couple of weeks ago. The $3 million, the $1 million don't count. It was $53 million. And remember the great Brinks robberies that have been linked to the Nazis, and the great train robbery linked to Otto Skorzeny in Europe, and the money spent in Brazil and South America. There's been counterfeiting, there's been murders, and now they're servicing, because there comes a time where you stop talking and you come out in the open, and they have the weapons. I'm sure that a lot of the missing weapons from these various stockpiles that we've been reading about have gotten into their hands. They have the means, they have the technology, but this Mr. Pierce that wrote this book, The Turner's Diary, is an activist in every sense of the word. He's very clear. He's reaching, as he says, the college professors. He's drawn big salaries. He's gotten Air Force contracts. Now, the church, the Aryan Brotherhood, was set up by a man that worked at Lockheed, the engineer from Lockheed that's up in Idaho. And so, Mr. Butler, so these people do have the technology and the inroads inside the corporation. And I always said Lockheed was the umbrella organization with the Hughes Corporation for the Nazification of America. This is very scary. I have a lot more to discuss, but my time is up. I have to stop because the tape is running out and the hour is running out. I can't go any further. So this is Mae Brussell. We'll have to wind up for this evening. Write your letters on Edwin Meese. I'll be back with you next week on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.